The moment the new CEO walked in, the Omega he left behind forgot how to breathe. The conference room fell into a silence that didn't need to be called for. It just happened, like the air itself shifted when Marcus Knox stepped through the glass doors. Tailored suit, steady stride, the kind of presence people adjusted themselves around without thinking, and one by one, department heads moved forward to greet him, hands extended, names exchanged, polite smiles offered and taken back just as quickly, everything smooth, controlled, expected, until his gaze swept across the room and stopped, just for a fraction of a second, long enough to recognize a face he shouldn't have recognized so easily. Noel Vale stood at the far end of the line, fingers curled tightly around a thin stack of files, his posture stiff as if he had been caught mid-step and didn't know how to move again. And for a single heartbeat, their eyes met, and Noel froze completely, like something inside him had been pulled taut, before he dropped his gaze too fast, almost like a reflex, his head lowering, shoulders drawing inward as if he could make himself smaller, less visible, less real. The line kept moving. Introductions continued, Marcus shaking hands, nodding, listening, but his attention had already shifted, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that when he reached the last person, he didn't move on immediately. Instead, he paused, just a second longer than necessary, and the room, already quiet, seemed to tighten around that moment without anyone understanding why. Marcus extended his hand, calm, composed. Marcus Knox, he said, even though it was unnecessary, and Noel hesitated just slightly before placing his hand in Marcus's, his grip light, uncertain, like he wasn't sure how long he was supposed to hold on, and Marcus noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. The faint tremor in Noel's fingers, the way his pulse seemed just a little too fast beneath the contact. And instead of releasing immediately like he had with everyone else, Marcus held on a fraction longer, not enough to be obvious, just enough that Noel became aware of it, his fingers tightening instinctively. Before he tried to pull back, and only then did Marcus let go, his expression unchanged as if nothing about that moment had been deliberate. "How long have you been working here, Noel?" he asked, voice even, controlled, but the question itself already more than he had asked anyone else. And Noel blinked, clearly caught off guard. About a year," he answered, his voice soft, uneven, eyes still lowered. "And your role?" Marcus continued without stepping away, still standing there while the rest of the room waited. And Noel swallowed lightly. "Data entry, reports," he said, the words coming out in pieces. And Marcus gave a small nod, as if considering something before finally moving on, the moment ending outwardly but not truly over. As soon as the introductions wrapped and people began to disperse, the whispers returned, quiet but sharp, slipping through the room like something alive. "Did you see that?" Someone murmured. He stopped at Noel. Another replied. Asked more than anyone else. A third added with a faint laugh. "Guess the new boss already found someone interesting." And Noel kept his head down, pretending not to hear, though his ears burned and his chest felt too tight, focusing on gathering his papers and leaving the room as quickly as possible, because staying meant feeling that gaze again, and he didn't think he could handle it. Avoiding Marcus became his first instinct after that, something automatic, something necessary. He learned the timing of the halls, the rhythm of meetings, the moments when the executive floor would be busiest and when it would be empty, slipping through the day as quietly as possible, keeping his eyes on his work, his movements small, careful, controlled. But it didn't work the way he hoped it would, because Marcus kept noticing, and once Marcus noticed something, he didn't ignore it. Messages started coming, brief and formal, requests from the executive office asking Noel to come in, always for something minor, a report detail, a data check, something that could have easily been handled by anyone else. And each time Noel stepped into that office, the same tension returned. Marcus behind the desk, composed, unreadable, asking questions that were simple on the surface but stretched just a second longer than necessary, as if he were waiting for something else, something Noel never gave, because Noel answered quickly, quietly, never meeting his eyes for long, always stepping back as soon as he was allowed, leaving the room with the same careful urgency he had when he entered. Outside those closed doors, the whispers grew easier, bolder. "He's been called in again," someone said. "Must be nice," another replied. Told you, face like that doesn't need anything else, a third added, and Noel said nothing, just lowered his head and kept working, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced repetition, even when they paused for just a second too long before continuing. Even when the words stayed in his ears longer than they should have. Marcus heard it by accident, or at least that's what he told himself. Standing just outside the open workspace one afternoon, unseen behind the glass, when the conversation drifted clearly enough to reach him. Single dad, right? One voice said casually. Yeah, has been for a while. Another answered, still acts like he doesn't get how things work. A third added with a quiet chuckle, and Marcus stilled, the words settling into place in a way he didn't expect. Single dad, repeating once, twice, as his gaze shifted toward Noel without conscious thought. Noticing now the details he had overlooked before, the faint shadows under his eyes, the subtle fatigue in the way he moved, the way his shoulders seemed to carry something heavier than just work, and something about it didn't align with anything Marcus thought he knew, not with the past, not with the version of Noel he had kept in his mind for 3 years, and before he had fully decided why it mattered, he had already turned back toward his office, pressing the intercom with a single instruction, send Noel Vale in. And when Noel stepped inside a few minutes later, he looked exactly the same as always, careful, quiet, standing just inside the door as if unsure whether he should move further in. You wanted to see me, sir? He asked, and that word again, that distance, and Marcus leaned back slightly, studying him with a gaze that didn't soften. You have a child? He asked, direct, leaving no space to avoid it, and Noel's reaction was immediate, a slight widening of his eyes before he looked down, his fingers tightening at his sides. Yes, he said, barely above a whisper, and Marcus tilted his head just slightly, something colder settling beneath his calm, something sharper than before. I thought you had someone, he said, the words even but the meaning behind them anything but neutral. Guess he didn't stay. And Noel froze for just a second, his lips parting as if to answer before closing again, the response catching somewhere he couldn't push it out from. He's not. He started, then stopped, the sentence breaking apart before it could become anything real, and Marcus watched him, waiting, but Noel didn't continue, didn't look up, didn't give him anything more than that incomplete fragment, and the silence stretched, heavier now, filled with things neither of them said, until Noel took a small step back. Sorry. I have work, he said, the words simple, controlled, but his fingers trembled just slightly where they rested against his side, and before Marcus could decide whether to press further or let him go, Noel turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Marcus alone in the quiet that followed, staring at the space where Noel had just been, something unsettled rising beneath his composure, something that didn't fit into the story he had told himself all this time. And as the silence settled, one thought remained, clear and impossible to ignore. This wasn't the Noel he remembered, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that bothered him more than it should. Before Noel ever called him sir, he had already fallen for him, and Marcus never even noticed. The hallway carried the end-of-day noise in a steady wave, lockers shutting, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing off the polished floor, and Noel Vale stood a little off to the side with a book open in his hands, eyes fixed on a line he had read more than once without understanding, his fingers holding the page too tightly, as if that might make the words stay still long enough to make sense. You're still on that, someone said nearby, not loud, just enough. Do you even get it? Another voice added with a short, careless laugh. Noel's lips parted like he might answer, like the words might come this time, but they didn't. They never did in time, and he lowered his gaze instead, shoulders drawing in, waiting for it to pass, until it didn't, until another voice cut through, calm and steady. That's enough. Marcus Knox didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The shift was immediate, subtle but certain, the others stepping back without argument, glancing at each other before moving away, because Marcus was the kind of presence people didn't push against without thinking twice, and he didn't linger on them. His attention already moving on, landing briefly on Noel, just long enough to register the way Noel hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. If you don't understand something, ask, Marcus said, direct, not harsh, not soft either, and Noel blinked, lifting his gaze just enough to meet Marcus's for a second too long. Then he looked away. I will, he said, voice uneven. And Marcus gave a short nod like that was enough, like the moment was already over, before turning and walking away without waiting for anything more, because to him it had never been anything more than a small interruption in a day that mattered for other reasons. But Noel remembered. He remembered the exact tone, the exact pause, the way everything had gone quiet when Marcus spoke. And something about that moment stayed, small but steady, something that didn't fade the way most things did. And after that, he started noticing Marcus everywhere, not intentionally at first, just a familiar figure across the courtyard, a voice he recognized before he saw the face. Marcus answering questions in class without hesitation, speaking clearly, moving through everything with a certainty Noel didn't understand, and slowly, without realizing it, Noel began to look for him, choosing seats that gave him a clear view, taking longer routes that passed the places Marcus usually went, his attention drifting and then staying just a second too long. And when Marcus turned unexpectedly, once, Noel looked away too fast, like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't, even though Marcus didn't react, didn't notice, didn't see him at all, because to Marcus, Noel was just another student in a crowd that didn't matter. At home, the house was quiet in a way that made every sound feel sharper, lights on in empty rooms, dinner set neatly whether it was eaten or not. And Noel sat at the table with his book open again, reading slowly, stopping often, the same lines repeating until they blurred. When the front door opened and footsteps crossed the floor with familiar precision, Richard Vale didn't speak right away. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase down, and paused when he noticed Noel still at the table, still on the same page. "You're still working," he said, not questioning, just observing. Noel looked up a second slower than expected. "Yes," he answered. Richard stepped closer, his gaze moving from the book to Noel's face, noting the hesitation, the slight delay. Before each response, the unfinished thought waiting behind his eyes. "How's school?" he asked, simple, direct. Noel hesitated. "It's okay," he said, and that was enough, because Richard didn't rely on long explanations. He watched, he noticed, and he remembered. Earlier that week, Noel standing just outside a lecture hall, not going in, his attention fixed on someone inside. The way he hadn't moved even when others passed. The way his gaze stayed in one direction too long to be accidental. "You were watching someone," Richard said now, just as calmly, and Noel's fingers tightened slightly against the table, his eyes dropping. He didn't deny it, didn't explain it either, and Richard didn't press. He didn't need to. He already knew enough. "You need help," he said instead, shifting the conversation without really leaving it. Noel shook his head quickly. "I can try," he started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence not forming, and Richard lifted a hand slightly, not to silence him, just enough to pause him. "You don't have to struggle through everything alone," he said, his tone even, not soft, but not distant either. And then, as if the decision had already been made somewhere, between observation and conclusion, he added, "I'll arrange a tutor." Noel opened his mouth again. "It's okay. I don't," he tried, but Richard was already past that point, because for him solutions were actions, not discussions, and once he decided, the path was set. "I know who to ask," he said, and that was the end of it. When Marcus Knox heard about it, it wasn't framed like a favor, not really. It was presented as an arrangement with expectations already built into it, the kind that didn't need to be explained to be understood. Marcus listened in silence, weighing the time it would take, the inconvenience, and what refusing would cost, and he understood immediately that saying no wasn't an option he could afford. So he nodded once. "Understood," he said, not because he wanted to, but because it made sense to, and that was enough. The knock came 2 days later, short and measured. Noel stood at the door for a second before opening it, and the moment he did, everything in him seemed to pause again. Marcus stood there, closer than he had ever been before, real in a way that made Noel's thoughts scatter, his heartbeat quickening before he could steady it. "I'll be your tutor," Marcus said, direct, without explanation. Noel stared at him for a second longer than he should have, then stepped aside automatically. "Okay," he said softly, voice not entirely steady. Marcus walked in, setting his bag down. already looking around the room as if assessing it. We'll start with what you're working on, he said. Noel nodded quickly, moving to the desk, pulling out his books with slightly rushed movements. This one, he said, opening to a page. Marcus stepped closer, leaning in to look. Show me where you're stuck, he said. Noel pointed, his finger hovering over a line here. I don't understand this, he admitted. Marcus followed the line, reading quickly, then tapped the page lightly. You're skipping steps, he said. You can't move from here to here without this part. Noel nodded, even if it wasn't fully clear yet. Try again, Marcus said. Noel picked up his pen, writing slowly, stopping, starting again. No, not like that, Marcus said after a moment, shifting closer, his shoulder nearly brushing Noel's as he reached to indicate the line, not touching him, but close enough that Noel's hand paused, his breath catching just slightly before he forced it steady. Break it down. Marcus continued, voice calm, controlled, one step at a time. Noel nodded again, focusing, his writing uneven but more deliberate. Good, Marcus said after a moment, simple, without emphasis. But Noel's pen stopped for a fraction of a second before moving again, because that one word stayed longer than it should have, and somewhere between the quiet corrections, the steady instructions, and the closeness Noel didn't know how to handle, something shifted, something small but certain, the kind of change that didn't announce itself but never went away. And for Noel, it was the first time he realized that what he felt wasn't just admiration anymore, even if he didn't have the words for it yet. At first, he told himself it was just a job, and that was exactly how he treated it. Marcus Knox kept everything precise from the moment he stepped into Noel Vale's room. Bag set down, sleeves adjusted, voice steady. Open your notes, he would say, or start from the beginning. And Noel followed, quick to respond, a little too quick sometimes, movements slightly rushed, words coming out uneven but hopeful. And in those first few days, before he understood the distance Marcus was drawing, Noel still smiled without thinking, small, quiet smiles when something made sense. I think I got this part, he would say, glancing up, waiting. But Marcus never met that moment the way Noel hoped. Show me, was all he said, or try again. Calm, controlled, nothing extra, and slowly, Noel began to notice the absence of warmth, the way every attempt at something more just stopped, and the smiles faded, replaced by careful silence. Marcus noticed things too, just not the same things. He noticed the pauses, the repeated mistakes, the lag between explanation and understanding. The way Noel's thoughts seemed to fall half a step behind, and it grated on him more than he expected. You're not focusing, Marcus said one afternoon, tapping the page lightly, his tone sharper than before. You keep making the same mistake. Noel flinched, small but visible, his pen tightening in his hand. I'm trying, he said, voice quiet, and Marcus exhaled, the sound controlled but edged. Trying isn't enough if nothing changes, he replied, and Noel nodded quickly. I'm sorry, he said, the apology coming too fast, too automatic, and Marcus frowned slightly. Stop apologizing and fix it, he said, not loudly, but firm enough that Noel's shoulders tensed. Yes, Noel answered. Softer this time, his eyes dropping back to the page, his hand moving again, slower, more careful. The first time Noel almost cried. It happened quietly, barely there, his pen pausing mid-line, his breathing shifting just enough to notice. He blinked once. Then again, faster, like he was trying to push something back. I'll do it again, he said, voice unsteady, and Marcus paused, just for a second, his gaze lingering a fraction longer than before, something tightening in his chest before he looked away. Just break it down, he said, quieter, the edge in his tone pulling back slightly. One step at a time. Noel nodded, gripping his pen a little steadier now. And from then on, he became even more careful, measuring every word before he spoke, every movement before he made it, watching Marcus in small, unnoticed ways, adjusting himself constantly to avoid that sharp tone, to stay just within whatever line Marcus had drawn without ever explaining it. Outside the lessons, Noel started doing things Marcus never asked for, small, quiet things, a glass of water placed near his usual seat before he arrived, notes already organized so Marcus wouldn't have to wait, snacks left on the table with a soft, "You can have this," said without expectation. And one evening, he remembered something even smaller, something Marcus had mentioned once without thinking, and the next day the exact same drink was there, unopened, placed just slightly closer to Marcus's side of the desk. And Marcus noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything, the pattern, the intention behind it, the quiet effort, but he didn't acknowledge it, not directly, treating it as something irrelevant, something unnecessary, because that was easier than thinking about why it was there. The shift came the day Noel set a small bag on the table, hesitating just a second before speaking. "This is for your mother," he said, voice softer than usual. "I heard she wasn't well. These might help." And for the first time, Marcus didn't respond immediately, his gaze dropping to the bag, then lifting back to Noel, something in his expression hardening, tightening. "You don't need to do this," he said, his tone flat, controlled, and Noel shook his head quickly. "I just thought," he started, but Marcus cut him off, sharper this time. "I said you don't need to," he repeated, pushing the bag back across the table, the movement precise, final, and Noel's hand hovered in place for a second before pulling back slowly, his fingers curling slightly as if they didn't know where to go. "I'm sorry," he said again, quieter now. And Marcus didn't answer, his gaze shifting away, his jaw tightening just slightly before he spoke again. "Let's continue," his voice returning to neutral, but the distance was clearer now, colder, and Noel felt it immediately, even if he didn't understand why. While Marcus leaned back slightly, his thoughts sharper than his tone, he didn't need help, and he definitely didn't need pity. After that, something changed. Marcus became colder in ways that were subtle but consistent, his words shorter, his patience thinner, the pauses between instructions longer, and Noel adjusted again, shrinking himself just a little more, speaking less, moving more carefully, as if reducing himself could keep things steady. But it didn't feel the same anymore, not entirely, because something had been pushed away, something he didn't know how to fix. Still, there were moments, brief and inconsistent, when Marcus's tone would soften without warning, when he would explain something more slowly, correct Noel with more patience, or say good, in that same quiet way that stayed longer than it should have. And those moments only made everything harder to understand, because they felt real, they felt close to something Noel didn't dare name. And then they would disappear just as quickly, replaced by that same distance again, and Noel would sit there, pen in hand, eyes on the page, trying to keep up, trying not to fall behind, trying not to do anything wrong, while the quiet feeling he had carried from the beginning only grew, steady and unchanging beneath all of it. And no matter how cold Marcus became, Noel never stopped trying. The rumor spread faster than either of them expected, and it found Noel before he could pretend it didn't matter. By the time the last class ended, people were already whispering, glancing his way, the same kind of attention Noel had learned to ignore. So he kept his head down and walked the long way past the back corridor, books held close, footsteps careful and quiet, until a group stepped into his path and didn't move. "Heard you've got a private tutor now," one of them said, tone light, amused. Noel didn't answer, shifting slightly like he might pass, but they adjusted with him, blocking the way again. "Marcus Knox, right?" another added, a grin spreading. "Top of the class, must be nice." Noel's grip tightened around his books, his eyes lowering, waiting for it to pass the way it usually did. "What? You don't talk now," someone said, nudging him lightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to keep him in place. Noel stayed quiet, shoulders drawn in, until the tone shifted, sharper. "Figures," a voice said. "Guys like him always find a way." A short laugh followed. "Bet he's only doing it for the benefits." Noel didn't react, but his breathing changed, just slightly, and then the next line came, careless, dismissive. "Or maybe he just feels bad for you." And something in Noel tightened. "Don't," he said, the word coming out before he could stop it, soft but clear. The group stilled for half a second before one of them smirked. "What?" Noel's fingers curled tighter, his voice still low but steadier now. "Don't talk about him like that." And the reaction was immediate, surprised laughter. "Look at that," someone said. "He actually said something." Another step closer, not aggressive, just testing. "What? You gonna do something about it?" Noel didn't think. didn't pause. He stepped forward and pushed him back, clumsy, uncoordinated, but enough to break the rhythm, enough to shift the moment. Hey, the other guy stumbled a step, then straightened, expression changing. You serious right now? Noel didn't answer, his hands trembling slightly, but he didn't back away either, and that was enough for the situation to turn, not loud, not chaotic, just sudden movement. A shove returned, Noel losing his balance for a second before catching himself. Another push, stronger this time, and Noel couldn't hold it, stumbling back into the lockers, his grip loosening, books slipping from his arms. That all you've got? Someone said, stepping closer again, and Noel tried to steady himself, tried to stand straight. But he was slower, always just a step behind, and before anything else could happen, another voice cut in, sharper than before. That's enough. And this time it wasn't just control in Marcus's tone. It was something else, something harder, and the shift was immediate. Heads turning, space opening slightly as Marcus stepped in, his gaze fixed, steady. Back off, he said, not raising his voice, but not leaving room for argument either. And for a second it worked, for a second. They hesitated, and then one of them laughed. Relax, he said, hands raised slightly. We're just talking. Marcus didn't move, didn't respond to that, just held his ground, and the tension stretched, thin and sharp, before the group finally stepped back. Not fully retreating, but enough to break it. Whatever, someone muttered, turning away. Didn't know he mattered that much, another added, glancing between them. Guess we hit a nerve. And then, as they started to move off, one of them tossed the last line over his shoulder. Careless but precise. Should have known. Kid's been into you forever anyway. The words landing heavier than anything before, and for a moment, everything stilled again, Noel's breath catching, Marcus's expression tightening just slightly. But the group didn't stay to see the reaction. They were already gone, footsteps fading, voices blending back into the background. When the hallway quieted, the only sound left was the faint echo of Noel's breathing. Uneven, and Marcus looked at him properly then, taking in the details he hadn't before. The way Noel was holding his arm too carefully, the slight stiffness in his stance. Are you hurt? Marcus asked, direct. Noel shook his head quickly, too quickly. No, he said, even as he bent down to gather his books with hands that weren't entirely steady. I'm fine, he added, and Marcus didn't comment on that, just reached down and picked up the last of the papers, handing them back. You deal with that often? He asked, and Noel hesitated, then nodded once, small. It's nothing, he said. They just talk. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. And you don't report it? He asked. Noel shook his head again. It's okay, he said. I don't want to make it bigger. Marcus studied him for a second, then asked, what about your father? Noel's fingers curled around the edge of his books. He's busy, he said quietly. I don't want him to worry about small things. The answer's simple, matter of fact. And for a moment Marcus didn't say anything, just watched him, and then, after a pause, he spoke again. What he said? He began, voice lower now, controlled. About you liking me. Noel froze, the color rising to his face almost immediately, his grip tightening, his gaze dropping, and for a second he looked like he might deny it, might deflect, but instead he said, softly, it's true. The words barely above a whisper. I like you, he added, forcing the rest out before he could stop himself. But I don't need you to like me back, his voice unsteady now. If you're uncomfortable, you don't have to keep tutoring me, he said, the sentence coming out in pieces, but clear enough. And when he finished, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, stretching just long enough to make Noel's chest tighten, because Marcus didn't answer. Didn't react the way Noel had prepared himself for, didn't say anything at all, and Noel misread it the only way he could, his expression faltering, something breaking through the careful control he had been holding. I'm sorry, he said quickly, almost automatically, stepping back. I didn't mean to make things difficult. And before Marcus could respond, Noel turned, leaving before he could hear anything else, his steps uneven now, faster than they should have been. Like distance could fix what he had just done, but he didn't get far, because halfway down the corridor, his foot caught wrong, pain shooting up before he could steady himself, his balance slipping, and then a hand caught him before he hit the ground. Firm, steady, Marcus's grip tightening just enough to hold him upright. Careful, Marcus said, his voice closer now, and Noel blinked. Disoriented, the pain settling in slower than the moment itself. I'm okay, he said out of reflex, but Marcus didn't let go immediately, his gaze flicking down briefly. Then back up. You're not, he said simply, and before Noel could argue, Marcus shifted slightly, turning his back. Get on, he said. Direct, like it was already decided. Noel froze for a second. He started. But Marcus didn't turn. You're not walking like that, he said, and that was enough. Noel hesitated only a moment. Longer before carefully climbing onto his back, his hands resting uncertainly at first before settling. And when Marcus stood, the movement steady, grounded, Noel felt it immediately. The warmth, the stability, something solid he hadn't expected, and without thinking, he leaned forward slightly, his forehead resting lightly against Marcus's shoulder, his breath evening out as the distance between them disappeared in a way that felt too real, too close, the faint scent of Marcus's pheromones. Barely there but enough to notice, enough to make Noel's chest tighten in a different way, and Marcus stiffened for just a fraction of a second, almost imperceptible, before continuing forward without comment, his steps measured, controlled, carrying Noel out of the hallway and into the fading light beyond. And just before they reached the car, Marcus spoke again, his tone returning to something familiar, something steady. Finish your assignments tonight, he said, not turning. I'll check them tomorrow. And Noel nodded quietly against his shoulder, holding on to that moment a second longer than he should have, because even without an answer, even without anything clearly said, something had already changed. He told himself it meant nothing, but he didn't stop coming back. The change didn't happen all at once. It slipped in quietly, the way Marcus Knox adjusted his tone without noticing, the way his patience stretched just a little longer before tightening again. Try that again, he would say, but without the sharp edge that used to follow, and Noel felt it immediately, even if he didn't understand it, even if he didn't trust it completely, because warmth from Marcus came in brief, inconsistent moments, and Noel didn't know how to hold on to them without breaking. Something. One evening, sitting across from his friend, Noel tried to explain it, his words slow, uneven. He's different now, he said, fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve, and his friend leaned back, studying him with a knowing look. He knows you like him, he said simply, and he didn't stop tutoring you, didn't avoid you. What do you think that means? Noel blinked, taking a second longer than most people would. I don't know, he admitted, and his friend let out a short laugh. It means he didn't walk away, he said. And people like him don't stay unless they want to. Noel lowered his gaze, processing that slowly. So what do I do? He asked, quieter now, and the answer came just as quickly. Stop hiding, his friend said. Let him feel you. Noel didn't respond right away, but the words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. The next session, Noel hesitated longer than usual before opening the door, his hand lingering near the small scent patch he always wore, then slowly pulling it away instead, his heartbeat uneven as he stepped back into the room. And when Marcus arrived, it didn't take long for him to notice, his gaze pausing for just a fraction of a second, something shifting behind it before settling again. You're not wearing your patch, Marcus said, his tone calm but more controlled than usual. Noel hesitated. I forgot, he replied, and Marcus held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Put it on, he said, not raising his voice, but leaving no room to ignore it, and Noel's chest tightened instantly, misunderstanding the reaction. I'm sorry, he said quickly, already stepping back, his fingers fumbling slightly as he fixed the patch in place, the faint trace of his scent fading almost immediately. I didn't mean to bother you, he added, quieter now, and Marcus didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening just slightly before he looked away. We'll stop here today, Noel said after a moment, his voice smaller than usual. I'm a little tired. Marcus nodded once. Fine, he said, gathering his things without question. At the door, Noel hesitated, then asked softly, Did it bother you? Marcus paused, his hand resting on the handle. No, he said, then added, lower this time. You just overestimate my self-control. and left before Noel could ask anything else. Later that night, Noel repeated the words carefully, like he was trying to understand something just out of reach, and his friend stared at him for a second before shaking his head, half amused, half exasperated. "That's not rejection," he said. "That's the opposite." Noel blinked, confused. "It is?" His friend leaned forward slightly. "He noticed," he said, "and he didn't walk away." "You're still here, aren't you?" Noel didn't answer, but something inside him shifted, something quieter, steadier. The next time Marcus came over, the room felt smaller before either of them said anything. The space between them thinner in a way Noel couldn't explain, and while Marcus was explaining a problem, his focus on the page, Noel found his attention drifting again, not to the work, but to him. The way his voice stayed even, the way he leaned slightly closer when pointing something out, and without fully deciding to. Noel leaned in just a little, enough that their shoulders brushed, the contact light, almost accidental, and Marcus stopped mid-sentence for a fraction of a second before continuing, slower this time. "I told you," he said quietly, "not to overestimate my self-control." Noel blinked, lifting his head, confusion clear in his expression. "What does that mean?" he asked, and Marcus looked at him then, really looked at him. At the open, unguarded way Noel met his gaze, the kind of honesty that didn't know how to hide itself, and something in Marcus shifted, not breaking, not fully, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt the same. He didn't move away, didn't close it either, just stayed there, closer than before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, filled with something neither of them named. And when Marcus finally leaned back, the movement was controlled again, deliberate, as if he were putting something back in place. "Focus," he said, his tone steady, but softer than it had been before. And Noel nodded quickly, looking back down at the page, even though the words blurred for a second before settling again. The rest of the lesson passed in a quiet that felt different from before, not cold, not distant, just aware, like every small movement carried more weight than it should have. And when it was time for Marcus to leave, he didn't rush, didn't linger either, just stood at the door for a second longer than necessary before speaking. "Finish your assignments," he said. "The same as always, but not entirely the same. I'll check them tomorrow." Noel nodded. "Okay," he answered softly, and as Marcus stepped out, he paused just briefly, not turning back, not saying anything else, but not leaving immediately either, as if something unfinished lingered in the space between them, something that neither of them had crossed yet. And when the door finally closed, Noel stood there a moment longer, his hand still resting on the edge of the desk, his heartbeat slower now, but not steady, because even without anything clearly said, something had shifted again, and this time, neither of them could pretend they hadn't felt it. For a while, it felt steady, and that was exactly why neither of them questioned it. The days that followed settled into something quieter, something that didn't need to be defined, lessons that started the same but no longer stayed within the boundaries they once had. Marcus Knox arriving on time, placing his bag down. "Show me what you did," he would say, and Noel Vale would lean a little closer than before, just enough that the space between them didn't feel like something he had to measure anymore. And Marcus didn't move away, not like he used to. He stayed, and that alone changed the weight of everything. Noel tried harder, not because Marcus demanded it, but because he noticed the small shifts, the way Marcus's tone softened when he got something right. "Better," he would say, "quieter now," and Noel would nod, focusing more, even if the improvement was small, because it mattered, because Marcus noticed. One evening, the pen in Noel's hand slowed, then stopped, his gaze drifting from the page. "I used to be better," he said after a long pause, his voice softer than usual, and Marcus looked up, waiting. "When I was little, I got really sick," Noel continued, his fingers tightening slightly around the pen. "They said it was too late when they brought me in," he added, not looking at Marcus. "After that, I just couldn't keep up anymore." The words came slowly, unevenly. "I try," he said, quieter now, "but it's always slower." And then, almost like a question, "You probably think it's frustrating." Marcus didn't answer immediately, something in his expression shifting, something heavier than before. He reached out without thinking, his hand settling briefly over Noel's, steady, grounding. "I don't," he said simply. And Noel blinked, looking up, uncertain. You don't have to be like anyone else, Marcus added, his voice lower now, controlled but softer than it had ever been. And for a moment Noel didn't respond, his thoughts catching up slowly. I still want to try, he said finally, and Marcus held his gaze for a second before nodding. Then we'll do it your way, he said, and something in Noel's chest eased. Just a little. It didn't fix everything, but it shifted something between them. In the way Noel stopped apologizing as quickly, in the way Marcus gave him more time before, stepping in, and in the quiet that no longer felt empty. It was around that time, on a night when Noel had been more distracted than usual, missing steps he normally caught. Marcus noticed first. You're not focusing, he said, but there was no edge to it this time. Just observation, and Noel hesitated before answering. I don't feel great, he admitted, and Marcus studied him for a moment. The faint tension in his posture, the way his hand pressed briefly against his own side before dropping again. Then we'll stop, Marcus said, already reaching to close the notebook, but Noel shook his head lightly. It's okay, he said, though his voice didn't quite match the words, and the silence that followed stretched differently than before, heavier, slower, until Noel shifted closer without fully thinking about it, the distance between them disappearing in a way it hadn't before. And Marcus stilled, just for a second, something in his control tightening and then slipping. And that night, the line they had been careful around quietly gave way. Not rushed, not forced. Just something neither of them stepped back from. Something they never named afterward. The next days didn't acknowledge it directly, but everything carried it. In the way Noel stayed a little closer without hesitation. In the way Marcus's gaze lingered just a fraction longer before looking away. In the way neither of them returned to what they had been before. It might have stayed that way if nothing else had interfered, if the world outside that small space hadn't started pressing in again. It happened after class one afternoon. Someone Noel didn't recognize stepping into his path with an easy smile. You're Noel, right? The Omega asked, voice light, practiced. Noel hesitated before nodding. I've heard a lot about you, he continued, glancing toward the building behind them. Mostly about who you've been spending time with. Noel's fingers tightened slightly around his bag. What do you mean? He asked, and the Omega tilted his head, studying him with something that didn't quite feel kind. Marcus Knox, he said, like it was obvious. You didn't know? Noel's chest tightened. Know what? He asked, quieter now, and the Omega smiled faintly. That he was never supposed to be there for you, he said. Your father made sure of that. Noel froze, the words not settling all at once. He paid for treatment. The Omega continued casually. People don't do that for nothing. Noel shook his head slightly. That's not, he started, but the Omega cut him off. You really didn't know, he said, almost thoughtfully. He agreed because he had to. Noel's breath caught, his certainty slipping just enough to matter. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now, and the Omega's expression softened in a way that felt worse than mockery. Believe what you want, he said, stepping back slightly, but don't pretend you're not making things harder for him. Noel didn't move, didn't respond, the words settling unevenly, and before he could ask anything else, the Omega added quietly, You're not the only one in his life, and then he left, just like that. Noel didn't confront Marcus. Not that day. Not the next. He tried to act the same, to listen, to focus, but everything felt different now. Every word Marcus said carried something else behind it. Every moment of closeness felt uncertain, like it might not belong to him at all, and the thought stayed, growing louder the more he tried to ignore it, until it became something he couldn't hold anymore. The letter came together slowly, lines written and rewritten, words crossed out and simplified, until all that was left was something Noel could manage, something that didn't ask for anything back. And when he finally folded it, his hands trembled slightly, but he didn't stop. He left it where Marcus would find it, along with everything else he thought he should return. Marcus didn't understand it at first, the letter too simple, too clean, saying Noel had changed his mind, that he had someone else now, someone more suitable, that he didn't need the lessons anymore. And he read it once, then again, as if the meaning might change, but it didn't, and something in him tightened in a way he didn't expect. He tried to find Noel after that, But it didn't take long to realize he wasn't being allowed to. A quiet warning delivered without raised voices. Just enough to make the boundary clear, and Marcus understood it even if he didn't accept it. But there were things he couldn't push through, not without consequences that reached further than just himself. The chance to leave came not long after. Something he had been working toward long before Noel had become part of his life. And this time he didn't hesitate, because staying didn't change anything anymore. And leaving gave him something he could still control. Time moved differently after that, measured in things that had nothing to do with the past, until it didn't anymore. And when everything that had taken him away no longer held him there, Marcus still found himself back where he had started, the decision made in a way that didn't feel like a decision at all, only that something unfinished had brought him back, something he had never really left behind. He should have stopped caring the moment he walked back into that building, but something in him refused to. The office moved around Noel Vale like he wasn't fully part of it. Conversations flowing past him, instructions given too quickly, patience running out before he could catch up, and Marcus Knox noticed it in fragments. The extra seconds Noel needed to respond. The way people didn't wait for those seconds. "You're still not done?" Dylan Carter's voice cut in one afternoon. Not loud, just sharp enough to carry. "It's not that hard," he added, leaning back in his chair with an easy, dismissive confidence. And Noel didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just nodded, fingers moving faster across the keyboard even though it didn't help. "I'll finish it," he said quietly, and Dylan gave a short exhale through his nose, unimpressed. "You said that 10 minutes ago," he replied, not looking at Noel anymore, as if the conversation was already beneath him. From behind the glass of his office, Marcus watched the exchange without meaning to, something tightening in his chest in a way that didn't match the distance he had spent years building. Because this version of Noel, quiet, withdrawn, absorbing everything without pushing back, should have been easy to ignore, should have made sense given everything that had happened, and yet it didn't. It showed up again in smaller moments. Noel sitting alone in the break room, eating slowly without really tasting the food, or standing by the window during short breaks, staring out as if giving himself a few seconds to breathe before going back. And Marcus noticed those too, not intentionally at first, but once he did, he couldn't seem to stop. The first time Noel smiled, it caught him completely off guard. It wasn't directed at anyone in the room, wasn't meant to be seen. Noel sat at his desk, phone held slightly closer than usual, his eyes softening in a way Marcus hadn't seen in years, unguarded, warm, real. And for a moment Noel looked almost like he used to, lighter, quieter, untouched by everything that came after. And Marcus found himself watching longer than he should have, until Noel blinked and the smile faded, his expression closing off again as if that moment had never existed. It happened again the next day, and this time Marcus caught a glimpse of the screen, just enough to understand. A child laughing at something off camera, bright and unfiltered, and Noel's thumb moved slightly as he replayed the clip, the same small smile returning, softer this time. And something in Marcus shifted again, something he didn't have a name for, something that made it harder to look away. The contradictions built quietly, Noel avoiding him whenever possible, answering only when necessary, keeping a careful distance as if proximity itself was something to be managed, and yet still the same in those unguarded moments, still carrying that quiet sincerity Marcus remembered. And it didn't match the ending Marcus had accepted, didn't match the version of the story he had told himself for years. "You're skipping a step," Dylan's voice cut through again later, this time closer, standing just behind Noel's chair, leaning slightly into his space. "Without asking. If you do it like that, you're going to mess up the whole thing." His tone wasn't raised, but it wasn't kind either, and Noel stiffened slightly, nodding as he tried to follow. "Okay," he said softly, adjusting what he was doing. And Dylan watched for a second longer before straightening, a faint frown on his face as if debating whether to say more. "Just pay attention," he muttered before stepping away. Marcus saw that too, the way Dylan stood just a little too close, the way Noel leaned in just enough to listen, not out of comfort but necessity. And something in Marcus sharpened, a quiet irritation that didn't quite have a place yet. It surfaced again when Dylan pushed a stack of papers back across Noel's desk with a casual flick. "Fix it," he said, the same tone as before, and Noel's fingers tightened slightly around the edges before he nodded. "I will," he answered, and Marcus moved before he fully decided to, stepping out of his office, his voice cutting in, calm but firm. "If there's an issue, explain it properly." Dylan straightened almost immediately, the shift subtle but clear. He started, but Marcus didn't give him space to finish. "Then explain it," he repeated, his gaze steady, and for a moment Dylan held it, something unreadable passing through his expression before he looked away, jaw tightening just slightly. He skipped a step. He said finally, tone clipped now, less dismissive than before, and Marcus gave a short nod. "Then show him," he replied, not looking away until Dylan did exactly that. The moment settled differently after that, the edge in the room dulling just enough, and when Marcus turned back toward his office, he didn't look at Noel again, but he was aware of the shift behind him, the space that had opened up, however small. It didn't change everything. Noel still moved through the office the same way, quiet, careful, keeping his distance, especially from Marcus, answering only when necessary, avoiding eye contact when he could, as if being near him was something he needed to manage just as much as everything else. And Marcus noticed that too, more than he wanted to, more than he should have, because every time Noel stepped away, something in him registered it, something that didn't match the version of detachment he told himself to hold on to. The contradictions kept building, Dylan's presence sharp and inconsistent, Noel's quiet persistence, the brief flashes of warmth that didn't belong in the life Marcus thought Noel had chosen, and the question returned, quieter but more insistent each time. Why did it still matter? Why did any of it still matter? And for once, Marcus didn't answer himself right away. He just stood there, watching from a distance he hadn't chosen but hadn't closed either, the space between them unchanged on the surface, but no longer simple in the way it used to be. He should have kept his distance, but Marcus didn't give him a choice. The announcement came late in the afternoon. The project wrapped ahead of schedule, results better than expected, and Marcus Knox standing at the front with the same calm authority. "We're doing a team dinner tonight," he said, voice even. "Everyone attends." And Noel Vale felt the tension settle in his chest before he could think of a way out. These weren't places he knew how to exist in, weren't places he belonged. And while the room filled with easy excitement, Noel kept his head down, already planning how to slip away unnoticed. His phone buzzed once, a short message that didn't need a name. "Don't skip it." Noel hesitated, then typed back slowly. "I'm not feeling well." The reply came immediately. "Then show up and leave early." And that was it. No room to argue, no space to refuse, just a decision made for him. And Noel knew better than to push further. "Okay," he said, even though it didn't feel like one. Outside, he pressed his phone to his ear, voice low. "Kai, I don't think I should go." And on the other end, Kai Tran sighed softly. "You're already going," he said, half amused, half resigned. "Just stay near someone you trust. Don't drink anything you didn't open, and text me if it gets weird." Noel nodded, even though Kai couldn't see him. "I will," he said quietly before ending the call. The restaurant was louder than Noel expected, lights softer but the noise heavier, conversations overlapping in a way that made it hard to focus, and he stayed near the edge of the group, trying to take up less space. But it didn't last. Someone pressed a glass into his hand with an easy grin. "You should try this." Noel shook his head lightly. "I don't really drink," he said, but the alpha waved it off. "It's just juice," he insisted. "Relax." Noel glanced down at the glass, harmless enough, and against his better judgment, he took a small sip, then another when they nudged him. The taste sharper than expected, but not enough to make him stop. Across the room, Marcus noticed without meaning to, the way Noel held the glass too carefully, the slight delay in his reactions, and he told himself it wasn't his concern, that Noel's choices weren't his to monitor, but his gaze returned anyway, until it stayed. It didn't take long for the shift to show. Noel setting the glass down too quickly, his hand lingering on the table as if he needed the support, the lights catching in his eyes too brightly, and when he tried to move, his balance didn't follow, his steps uneven in a way he couldn't hide. "Careful," a voice said closer this time, and Noel turned too late, his body tilting forward as the room blurred, his shoulder brushing into Dylan Carter before he could steady himself. Dylan froze for a fraction of a second, completely unprepared, Noel's weight pressing lightly into him, hands landing weakly against his chest, fingers curling without strength, and the scent hit him before the moment fully registered. Something soft, familiar, dangerously close, and for once, Dylan didn't move. Didn't push him away like he normally would, his hands hovering awkwardly at Noel's sides before, settling there to keep him upright, his breath catching slightly as his posture went rigid, heat rising faintly along his neck. "Hey," he started, but the words didn't come out the way he intended, quieter, less sharp, and Noel blinked, unfocused, leaning just enough that the distance disappeared completely, his head dipping closer to Dylan's shoulder, unsteady, unaware. Across the room, Marcus saw everything. The way Noel leaned into someone else, the way Dylan didn't move, didn't pull back. And something in Marcus shifted instantly, sharper, less controlled, closing the distance in a few quick steps before thought could catch up, his hand catching Noel's wrist, firm but controlled as he pulled him back. "That's enough," he said, voice low, final, and the change was immediate. Dylan letting go without protest this time. Though his expression didn't fully reset, something lingering there, unreadable, as he stepped back, jaw tightening just slightly as he looked away. "I'll take him home," Marcus added, already guiding Noel out before anyone could question it. And the murmurs followed them anyway, quiet but persistent, filling the space behind them. The car ride was silent at first, Noel, leaning back against the seat, his breathing uneven, head tilted as if he couldn't keep it steady. And Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening slightly on the wheel, the silence stretching until Noel shifted beside him, a soft sound escaping before he spoke. "It's too much," his voice unfocused, and Marcus glanced over briefly. "You'll be okay," he said, steady, but Noel shook his head slowly. "Not that," he murmured. "Everything." And then his voice broke, the words slipping out. "Unfiltered. Everyone's like that. They don't like me. They think I'm slow, they don't wait." His fingers curled into his sleeve. "I try. I really try." His voice dropped lower, more fragile, but he turned slightly toward Marcus, eyes glassy, searching. "You find me annoying too, right?" The question came out softer than anything else he had said, but it carried more weight than all of it. Marcus didn't answer immediately, something in his chest tightening sharply, and before he could stop himself, he pulled the car to the side, the sudden stillness filling the space between them. "No," he said quietly, turning toward Noel. Fully, his voice lower now, no longer distant. "It's not like that." Noel blinked slowly, taking a moment to process, his shoulders trembling slightly as the tension slipped through. "Then, why do you look at me like that?" he asked, softer now, and Marcus exhaled, something in him giving way. "I shouldn't have," he admitted, simple but heavier than it sounded. And Noel stared at him as if trying to understand something just out of reach, before his voice dropped again, small, hesitant. "Can you hug me?" Marcus didn't hesitate this time, reaching out and pulling Noel into him, the contact steady, grounding, and Noel leaned in immediately, his hands gripping lightly at Marcus's shirt as if anchoring himself there. "I'm tired," he murmured, his voice fading. "I missed you." The words slipping out before he could stop them, before he could understand them, and then his breathing slowed, his body relaxing as sleep took over, his weight settling fully against Marcus. For a moment, Marcus didn't move, his hand resting at Noel's back, his thoughts quieter than they had been in a long time, and when he finally pulled away, it was careful, adjusting Noel back into the seat before starting the car again, the destination changing without him saying it out loud, because taking Noel anywhere else didn't feel like an option. Not tonight, not like this. And as the car moved through the quiet streets, Marcus kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting briefly against Noel's shoulder, as if making sure he was still there, as if something had already begun to shift in a way he could no longer ignore. He should have left things as they were, but the morning after made that impossible. Noel Vale woke with a start, unfamiliar light cutting across his vision, the ceiling above him not his own, and for a second his chest tightened in pure instinct before memory caught up, fragments of last night slipping back unevenly. The noise, the glass in his hand, the dizziness, and then, "Marcus," He pushed himself upright too quickly, breath catching, fingers gripping the edge of the couch as he steadied himself. And just as the panic began to settle in, the soft sound of footsteps reached him from the other room, steady, unhurried. Marcus Knox appeared a moment later, composed as always, carrying a tray like it belonged there. Like Noel waking up in his space wasn't something unusual at all. "You're up," he said, voice low, even, and Noel froze, shoulders tensing before his gaze dropped immediately. "I'm sorry." The words came out first, quiet, instinctive, and Marcus didn't react to the apology, just set the tray down in front of him. "Eat first," he said instead, simple, controlled, and Noel's eyes flicked up just long enough to notice the food. Familiar, exactly what he liked, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. Beside it a neatly folded set of clothes, prepared, deliberate, and Noel's fingers hovered for a second before pulling back. "Thank you," he said softly, then hesitated, voice lowering further. "Last night. I didn't do anything out of line, right?" Marcus shook his head once. "No," he replied, and without thinking, his hand lifted briefly, brushing lightly over Noel's hair in a gesture so natural it made Noel go still, completely unprepared for it, before Marcus withdrew again, his expression returning to neutral. "Eat," he added, quieter, "then shower." Noel nodded quickly, lowering his gaze, focusing on the tray as if it were the only safe thing in the room. He tried to eat, tried to keep his hands steady, but the quiet pressed in too close, the memory of Marcus's voice from last night lingering where it shouldn't. And before he could stop it, his vision blurred, his grip tightening as he turned his face slightly away, wiping at his eyes in a small, hurried motion. Marcus noticed, of course he did, his gaze resting on Noel longer than it should have. "Are you still feeling unwell?" he asked, voice even but closer now, and Noel shook his head too quickly. "I'm fine," he said, forcing it out, even as something inside him tightened sharply, a warning rising fast. "You didn't forget him. You just buried it. And now it's back." And he pressed his lips together, thoughts turning harsher. "Don't be stupid. Don't let this happen again. You're not the same. You don't belong near him anymore." But the warmth from just a moment ago lingered, making it harder than it should have been. The ride to work was quiet. Noel sitting straighter than necessary, hands folded in his lap, distance rebuilt in every small movement, and Marcus didn't break the silence, didn't push, just drove. But something about it felt heavier than before. The moment they stepped into the office, it shifted, the glances, the murmurs not quite quiet enough. "So that's what happened," someone muttered. "Didn't expect that," another added, and Noel's steps faltered for a fraction before he forced himself forward, shoulders drawing in slightly, the weight of it settling in a way that felt all too familiar. But before it could build, a sharper voice cut through. "Knock it off." Dylan Carter's tone was firm this time, lacking the careless edge he usually carried, and the room quieted just enough to notice. "You don't know anything, so don't talk like you do," he added, his gaze flicking briefly toward Noel before looking away again, jaw tightening slightly as if annoyed at the situation, or at himself. Noel blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure, and Dylan shifted, rubbing the back of his neck in an awkward motion. "Just focus on your work," he muttered, voice lower than before, almost reluctant. And later, when Noel hesitated over a task, Dylan stepped closer again. But this time there was less pressure in the movement, his tone more controlled. "You're missing a step," he said, pointing at the screen. "Do it like this." Noel leaned in slightly, trying to follow, nodding slowly. "Okay," he replied, and Dylan stayed a second longer than necessary, watching to make sure he understood before stepping back, though not as far as before. From across the room, Marcus saw it all, the shift in Dylan's behavior, the reduced distance, the way Noel leaned in without realizing. And something in Marcus tightened, sharper this time, more defined, an edge that hadn't been there before. And before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped out of his office, crossing the floor in a few steady strides, stopping just beside Noel's desk. "I need him," he said, voice calm but not a request, and Dylan straightened immediately, stepping back without argument. Though his expression flickered briefly, something unreadable passing through before it disappeared. "Yeah," he said shortly, and Noelle looked up, startled, gaze moving between them before settling on Marcus, uncertain. Come with me, Marcus added, already turning, and Noelle followed without hesitation, his steps quick, and once the door closed behind them, the air changed, quieter but tighter, the distance between them no longer buffered by anyone else. And Marcus didn't speak right away, his gaze steady, controlled, but no longer distant in the way Noelle had been relying on, and for the first time since that morning, Noelle felt the warning in his chest rise again, louder this time, because whatever line he thought he had redrawn between them was already starting to blur in ways he couldn't stop. He should have drawn the line, but Marcus kept stepping over it. In the days that followed, his care stopped being subtle and turned into something Noelle Vale couldn't pretend not to notice. A warm drink and a small breakfast waiting on Noelle's desk each morning. His workload quietly adjusted so it never tipped past what he could handle. Mistakes no longer called out in front of others, but handled in private. Marcus walking him through each step with a patience Noelle didn't know how to accept. And once, Noelle even realized a section of his report had been corrected before submission, cleaned up without a word so it wouldn't come back on him. Do it like this next time, Marcus had said, nothing more, and that silence made it worse, because every small, precise action pulled Noelle closer to something he had already decided he couldn't afford. By the weekend, Noelle realized he'd left a charger and a folder at Marcus's place, and at first he planned to let it go, but the message came anyway, short, direct, come get your things. There wasn't a real way to refuse, so he told himself he'd be quick, in and out, no thinking, no lingering. Standing outside the familiar door, Noelle took a slow breath and rang the bell, already bracing himself, but when it opened, it wasn't Marcus on the other side. It was the Omega from before. The recognition was instant, sharp, and the Omega's expression shifted just as quickly, a faint smile forming that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, it's you, he said lightly, and Noelle stilled, fingers tightening at his side. I came to pick up my things, Noelle said, voice quiet, controlled, and the Omega tilted his head, looking him over in a way that felt deliberate. Coming to my boyfriend's place to pick up your things, he repeated, softer now, but edged. That's bold. Noelle's breath caught, the words landing before he could prepare for them. I didn't, he started, but the Omega cut him off with a small, dismissive motion. You don't have to explain, he said, stepping just a little closer, still keeping the doorway to himself. I've heard enough, his gaze sharpened. You've been hovering around him again, haven't you? Noelle shook his head instinctively. No, I'm not. But the Omega's expression didn't change. You should stop, he said calmly. He's already done more than enough for you. Noelle felt something in his chest tighten, sharp and immediate. I didn't ask, he tried, but the Omega leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Don't misunderstand it, he said. Whatever kindness you think you're seeing, it's not that. His eyes flicked briefly past Noelle, into the apartment, then back. He owes you. Your family. That's all. Noelle went still, the words settling exactly where they were meant to land. So don't make things complicated for him. The Omega finished, almost gently. You're not someone who fits into his life. And that was it. Clean. Final. Noelle nodded before he realized he was doing it. A small, automatic motion, as if accepting something he had always known. And then he stepped back, turned, and walked away without waiting, without asking for Marcus, because he already understood enough, and staying even 1 second longer felt like it would break something he couldn't put back together. The walk home blurred, the thoughts repeating in quiet loops. Of course that's what it was. Marcus had his own life, someone who belonged beside him, someone who wasn't. Noelle, and everything else. The dinners, the quiet patience, the way Marcus remembered what he liked. It wasn't what Noelle had let himself fear it might be. It was just kindness, just obligation, just a debt being paid in the gentlest way possible. By the time he got home, his chest felt hollow, but his hands were steady as he moved through routine, taking care of Leo, answering him softly, making sure he was settled. And only when the apartment went quiet did Noelle sit down, pull out a sheet of paper, and write. The resignation letter coming out clean and simple. No explanation, just the necessary words to leave. The next morning, The office felt the same as always, too bright, too loud. But Noel moved through it like he was already outside of it. The letter held firmly in his hand until he stood in front of Marcus's office, knocked once, and stepped inside. "I'd like to resign," he said, placing the paper on the desk without looking up. Marcus didn't touch it, didn't even glance at it right away. "Why?" he asked, simple, direct, and Noel's fingers tightened slightly. "I'm not suited for this position," he replied, voice even, rehearsed. "I make too many mistakes." Marcus leaned back slightly, gaze steady. "That's not a reason," he said calmly, and Noel swallowed, pushing forward. "I don't want to cause problems for the company." The words sounding smaller the longer they sat there. "You weren't concerned about that yesterday," Marcus pointed out, and Noel's breath caught just briefly. "Yesterday was different," he said quietly. Marcus's gaze sharpened. "How?" Noel hesitated, silence stretching tight between them, and finally lowered his eyes. "I don't want to misunderstand things," he said carefully, "and make it difficult for you." Marcus didn't respond immediately, studying him now. "What exactly do you think you misunderstood?" he asked, voice lower, more controlled, and Noel shook his head quickly. "Nothing," he said, almost too fast. "I just think it's better if I leave." Marcus's expression didn't shift. "No," he said simply, and the word landed heavier than anything else. "I'm not approving this." Noel looked up then, startled despite himself. "Why?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and Marcus held his gaze, something unreadable beneath it. "Because you're leaving over something you won't even say out loud," he replied evenly. "If there's a reason, you tell me." And the silence that followed wasn't something either of them could step around anymore. He should have let it go, but Marcus refused to lose him again. The door shut with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing Noel Vale inside a space that suddenly felt too small to breathe in. And for a moment neither of them moved. Noel standing rigid near the desk, fingers clenched at his sides, while Marcus Knox watched him without looking away, the calm he had been holding on to thinning in a way he could no longer hide. "Tell me the real reason," Marcus said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, and Noel shook his head almost immediately. "I already told you," he replied, forcing the words out evenly. "It's better if I leave." Marcus didn't accept it, didn't even acknowledge it as an answer. "No," he said, firmer this time. "That's not a reason." The silence stretched tight, pressing in from all sides, and Noel stayed still, every instinct telling him to hold the line, to end this cleanly. But Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance Noel had been trying so hard to keep. "Look at me," he said, and Noel hesitated before lifting his gaze. Just enough, and that was all it took. Something in Marcus shifted, not explosive, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. "You're being cruel," he said, the words landing heavier than Noel expected, and Noel froze, confusion flashing across his face. "What?" he whispered, genuinely lost, and Marcus let out a short breath, something restrained finally slipping. "You started this," he continued, his voice lower now, but more deliberate. "You came to me first. You made it impossible to ignore you, and then you walked away." Noel's brows pulled together, trying to follow, trying to understand. "I didn't. You made me fall for you," Marcus said, cutting him off, quieter now but sharper for it. "And then you left like it didn't matter." Noel's eyes widened slightly, the words hitting in pieces he couldn't put together fast enough. "Last time, and now again," Marcus went on, his gaze steady, unrelenting. "You disappear whenever it suits you." Noel shook his head, more urgently now. "No, that's not true," his voice rising just slightly. "I've never played with your feelings. I wouldn't do that." His hands tightened. "But," he hesitated, the thought finally forcing its way out. "Don't you already have someone?" The question slipped out softer, but it changed everything. Marcus stilled, the tension breaking just enough for confusion to surface. "What?" he asked, and Noel swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "The Omega at your place," he said, voice quieter now. He said, "He's your boyfriend." The words felt strange even as he said them, but he didn't stop. "He told me not to misunderstand your kindness." Noel lowered his gaze. He said you were just helping me because you owed my family. The room went silent, but this time it wasn't sharp. It shifted, something heavier settling in its place, and Noel felt it before he understood it. The weight of what he had just admitted. Marcus stared at him for a long second, then frowned slightly. Like the idea itself didn't make sense, he said that. He repeated, almost under his breath, then shook his head once, the tension easing into something colder, clearer. He's not my boyfriend, he said, firm, without hesitation, and Noel blinked, looking up again. What? He's my advisor's son, Marcus clarified, his tone flat, almost dismissive now. He shows up more than he should. That's all. Noel stood there, the words taking a moment longer to settle, his expression shifting, confusion giving way to something else, something unsteady, like the ground beneath him had just shifted without warning. And in that moment it hit him all at once. Everything he had convinced himself of, every reason he had forced himself to accept, it collapsed, leaving nothing solid behind. Marcus watched that change happen, saw it in Noel's eyes, and stepped closer again, slower this time, more deliberate, until there was no distance left to hide behind. Look at me, he said again, softer now, and Noel did, even though his thoughts were still unraveling. Marcus held his gaze, steady, unflinching. My answer hasn't changed, he said, voice low, controlled. The only person I've ever been involved with is you. Noel's breath caught, the words landing deeper than anything else before them, and Marcus didn't look away, didn't give him space to retreat. You're the one who asked to break things off, he continued, quieter now, but each word precise. I never agreed. The sentence fell between them, simple, absolute, and for a moment, everything stilled. Noel stood there, caught between what he thought was truth and what Marcus was telling him now. The distance he had been clinging to gone, leaving him with nowhere to step back to, and Marcus didn't move, didn't soften, just stayed where he was, close enough that Noel could feel it, the weight of everything he had been avoiding, finally pressing in from all sides, demanding an answer he could no longer run from. He should have asked sooner, but Marcus finally listened. The air in the office felt different now, no longer just tense, but heavy with everything Noel Vale had been holding back, and for a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't decide where to begin, until his fingers tightened slightly, and the words came out quieter than anything he had said before. Back then, I didn't want to leave, Noel said, his voice unsteady but clear, and Marcus Knox didn't interrupt this time, didn't push, he just stood there, watching him, waiting. Noel lowered his gaze briefly, gathering himself. My father told me the truth, he continued slowly. About you, about your mom's hospital bills, about how he made you stay. His hands curled slightly. He said you didn't choose me, that you were just doing what you had to. Marcus's jaw tightened, just barely, but he didn't look away, and Noel went on, forcing himself to finish. I thought, if I stayed, I'd only hold you back. His voice dropped softer, more fragile. You were meant for more than that, not tied to someone like me. The words hung between them, raw, and Noel swallowed before adding. So I left first, simple, final, because I thought that would make it easier for you. Silence followed, not empty but full, the kind that carried years of misunderstanding all at once. Then, more quietly, almost like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it, Noel added. And, Leo, his voice softened further, he's yours. The confession settled between them, and Marcus didn't react with shock, didn't hesitate. He simply nodded once, steady. I know, he said, and Noel blinked, startled. What? Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, placing it on the desk between them. I wasn't guessing, he said evenly. I was waiting. Noel stared at the paper without touching it. Waiting for what? He asked, his voice quieter now, and Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. For you to let me in, he replied. Both of you. The words landed heavier than Noel expected, and before Noel could respond, Marcus continued, his voice lower now, more controlled. There was no fiancé, he said, cutting through the last piece of the past cleanly. I know that now. I should have known. Noel's breath caught slightly, and Marcus went on. I just didn't understand why you left without giving me a reason. His gaze didn't waver. Now I do. Noel stood there, feeling everything he had carried for years unravel in a way he couldn't stop. The version of the past he had forced himself to believe collapsing all at once, leaving him unsteady in a way he hadn't expected. Marcus stepped closer then, slower, deliberate, until there was no distance left between them, his presence no longer sharp but grounded, steady. Those years were hard, weren't they? He said quietly, not really asking, and Noel shook his head automatically. I'm okay, he said, then softer. Kai helped me a lot. His fingers loosened slightly as he spoke. I was just afraid that I wouldn't be enough, he admitted. I'm slow. I thought I wouldn't raise him well. His voice softened further, and then, with a small, almost shy certainty, but Leo, he's really good, he said. He's healthy and smart. Noel hesitated for a second before adding, quieter still, like you. Marcus didn't respond right away, something shifting in his expression before he exhaled slowly, stepping even closer, close enough that Noel could feel it without having to look away. When you were drunk, Marcus said, his voice lower now, softer. Then before, you said you missed me. Noel's breath stilled, and Marcus continued. You asked me to hold you. A brief pause, just enough. Do you still want that? The question was simple, but it carried everything they had been circling around, and Noel didn't hesitate this time, didn't retreat. He just nodded, small but certain, and that was enough. Marcus closed the remaining space without asking again, pulling him in with a steadiness that didn't waver, and Noel leaned into it immediately. Like something in him had finally given in, his hands gripping lightly at Marcus's shirt as if anchoring himself there. And Marcus held him just as firmly, one hand steady at his back, the other at his shoulder, grounding him, not letting him pull away this time. There were no more words, none that mattered more than this, just the quiet certainty settling between them. The past no longer something pulling them apart, but something they had finally faced, and neither of them moved, because this time, walking away was no longer an option. He thought he understood what he'd missed, but meeting his son made it real. The apartment was quieter than it had been the night before, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Not with Marcus Knox still there and Noel Vale moving through the space like he didn't quite know what to do with the new balance between them. Everything softer now, but not settled. And in the middle of it all was Leo, small and steady, watching everything with open curiosity like he always did. Noel stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, pretending to busy himself with things that didn't need doing, his mind still catching up to everything that had changed. While in the living room, Marcus remained where he was, seated but not distant, his attention shifting to the quiet presence nearby. Leo stood a few feet away at first, holding onto the plush dinosaur Marcus had given him, studying him with that same unguarded focus he used for everything new. And Marcus didn't rush it, didn't call him over, just met his gaze calmly, letting the silence sit until Leo took a small step forward on his own, then another, drawn by something he didn't need to explain. You're still here, Leo said finally, his voice soft but certain, and Marcus nodded once. I am, he replied, just as steady, and Leo seemed to consider that, fingers tightening slightly around the dinosaur before he asked, You're not leaving? The question was simple, but it landed deeper than it should have, and Marcus felt something in his chest shift quietly, something unfamiliar but grounding. Not if you don't want me to, he said, and Leo blinked, processing it in that straightforward way children did, before nodding once, like the answer made sense. Noel froze in the doorway when he heard that, his breath catching for just a moment before he forced himself to stay where he was, watching without interrupting, something in his chest tightening in a way that felt too close to breaking and too warm to push away. Leo moved closer then, stopping just in front of Marcus, tilting his head slightly. Papa says, You're busy, he said, almost thoughtfully. Are you still busy? Marcus shook his head, a faint hint of something softer crossing his expression. Not right now, he answered, and Leo accepted that just as easily, shifting the dinosaur in his arms before holding it up slightly. He likes you, Leo said, as if sharing something important, and Marcus let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Does he? He said, and Leo nodded again. He sleeps with me, he added seriously, so he knows. Marcus's hand lifted before he thought about it, resting gently over Leo's small head. careful, steady, and Leo didn't pull away, didn't hesitate, just leaned into the touch like it was something familiar even though it wasn't. And that simple response settled something deeper in Marcus than he had expected, something that had been waiting longer than he realized. Noel looked away for a second, pressing his lips together, his fingers curling slightly against the counter as he tried to steady himself. Because seeing them like that, so easy, so natural, felt like something he didn't know how to hold on to yet. "Do you want to see something?" Marcus asked after a moment, his tone still calm, and Leo nodded immediately, interest sparking, and Marcus reached for a pen and a scrap of paper from the table, sketching quickly, the lines simple at first, then clearer, forming a small dinosaur that looked almost like the plush toy Leo was holding, and Leo's eyes lit up instantly. "That's him," he said, stepping closer, almost bouncing on his feet. "That's him." Marcus handed the paper over without hesitation, and Leo took it carefully, like it was something valuable, before looking up again, brighter now. "Can you draw me too?" he asked, and Marcus didn't hesitate. "Of course," he replied, pulling the paper back and adding to it a smaller figure beside the dinosaur. Simple, but unmistakably Leo. And when he handed it back, Leo smiled fully this time, open and unguarded. "Thank you," he said, hugging both the drawing and the toy close, and Marcus watched him for a second longer than necessary, something quiet settling into place. Noel stepped forward then, unable to stay back any longer, his voice softer than usual. "Leo, you should get ready," he said gently. And Leo nodded, still holding on to everything Marcus had given him, before turning back once more. "You'll still be here?" he asked again, and Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he said, steady, and Leo accepted it again, just as simply, before heading off toward his room. When the space quieted again, Noel exhaled slowly, the tension he had been holding slipping just enough to let something else through, something more fragile. "You don't have to do all this," he said without looking directly at Marcus, his voice careful, like he was afraid of breaking something if he spoke too clearly. "He'll get attached." The words were soft, but they carried weight, and Marcus stood then, closing the distance between them in a few measured steps, not rushing, not forcing, just steady. "I already am," he said quietly, and Noel looked up at that, startled, and Marcus held his gaze, something firm beneath the calm now. "I'm not going anywhere," he added, not as a promise thrown lightly, but as something grounded, something he had already decided, and Noel didn't answer right away. Couldn't, because everything inside him was still trying to catch up, but this time, he didn't step back, didn't create distance. He just stood there, closer than before, letting the moment stay, letting it exist without running from it, because for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something he had to protect himself from. He thought one step would be enough, but building a life meant choosing it every day. It didn't happen all at once, not in a single declaration, but in a pattern that kept repeating until it became something real. Marcus Knox staying later, leaving earlier, until one night he didn't leave at all, and Noel Vale didn't ask him to. The apartment quietly reshaping around the three of them, an extra toothbrush by the sink, a second set of clothes folded into a space that used to be empty. Marcus adjusting his mornings so he could walk Leo to daycare, the small hand that fit around his finger tightening just a little whenever they reached the door. "You're coming back later, right?" Leo asked, looking up with steady expectation, and Marcus didn't pause. This time, didn't calculate. "I am," he answered, simple, certain, and Leo nodded like it was enough, because for him, it was. Noel watched from the doorway, his chest tightening in a way that wasn't fear anymore, just something unfamiliar, fragile, like he was standing too close to something he still didn't fully trust himself to hold. The company noticed before anything was said out loud, the shift in how Marcus moved around Noel, the way Noel stopped stepping back, and when the room finally settled one morning, Marcus didn't wait for it to become formal. "I don't repeat things twice," he said calmly, cutting through the quiet. "We're getting married." The words landed clean, leaving no space for interpretation, the room going still before reactions followed. But Marcus didn't look at anyone else, didn't need to. Dylan Carter found Noel later, no hesitation this time, just something more grounded, more honest. "I owe you an apology," he said, hands loose at his sides instead of crossed. I misjudged you. Noel looked up, surprised, and Dylan exhaled quietly. You were never the problem, he added. The words simple but deliberate. Then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than he intended, if it weren't for him, I would have tried. Noel blinked, unsure how to respond, and Marcus's presence shifted immediately behind him, silent but unmistakable, his gaze enough to make Dylan lift his hands and surrender. Relax, he muttered, stepping back. I said would've, and left it there. That evening, Kai leaned against the window beside Marcus, arms folded, watching the city below before speaking. You know now, he said, and Marcus didn't deny it. Not all of it. He replied, and Kai let out a slow breath, something heavier settling into his tone. Then listen, he said, glancing over. Those years weren't just hard. Marcus didn't interrupt, and Kai continued, quieter now. He got sick during the pregnancy. More than once. Didn't tell anyone. Marcus's jaw tightened, just slightly, but he didn't look away. After Leo was born, he barely slept. Worked whatever he could take. Learned everything alone. Kai paused, then added, more quietly. There were nights he fell asleep sitting up, still holding Leo. The image settled heavily, and for the first time, Marcus looked away, his gaze breaking for a brief second before returning, steadier but changed, and Kai finished simply. So if you're staying, don't make him wonder again. Marcus didn't answer out loud, but the silence carried something more certain than words. The last piece came quietly, without the sharpness it once held. When Marcus walked in to find Noel sitting across from the Omega who had once stood at his door, the tension different now, not hostile, just unresolved. He came to apologize, Noel said calmly, not moving away, and the Omega nodded once, his voice lower than before. What I said wasn't my place. Noel held his gaze for a moment before speaking, softer but clear. It hurt. The Omega nodded again, accepting it without argument, and stepped back, leaving the space lighter than before. Leo's voice broke through a second later as he ran into the room, arms wrapping around Marcus without hesitation. You're back, he said, and Marcus rested his hand on his head, grounding, steady. I am, he replied, and when he looked up, his gaze met Noel's, something unspoken but firm settling between them, not fragile anymore, not uncertain, but chosen, fully, and Noel didn't step back this time, didn't protect himself from it. He just stayed, letting the moment hold, because for the first time, it wasn't something he was afraid to keep. Some endings aren't about closure, they're about choosing to stay. The day didn't feel like a grand event, not in the way Noel Vale used to imagine. There were no overwhelming crowds or heavy expectations, just a quiet room filled with a few familiar faces, sunlight spilling softly through the windows, and the steady presence of Marcus Knox standing beside him like he had always been meant to be there. Leo sat near the front, legs swinging slightly from the chair, holding the same plush dinosaur and a folded piece of paper he refused to let go of, the drawing Marcus had made for him, as if it were part of the ceremony itself. Noel's hands were still for once, not tense, not uncertain, just resting at his sides as he looked. At Marcus, really looked this time, without hesitation, without the need to pull back, and Marcus met his gaze the same way, calm, certain, grounded in something that no longer needed to be proven. The vows were simple, spoken without flourish, but each word carried the weight of everything they had already lived through, everything they had chosen to face instead of walking away from. And when it was done, when the final words settled into something real, Marcus didn't rush, didn't move for the room. He reached for Noel's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, steady, warm, and Noel held on without hesitation, fingers tightening just slightly, as if anchoring himself there. Leo didn't wait for permission. He ran forward the moment he felt it was over, stopping just short before looking up at Marcus, his expression more serious than usual, like he had something important to say. Can I call you Dad now? The question came out clear, unguarded, and for the first time. That day, Marcus's composure shifted, just enough for something softer to break through. He crouched slightly to meet Leo's eyes, his voice quieter than before. Only if you want to, he said, and Leo nodded immediately, as if that answer had always been obvious. I do, he said, stepping closer. And this time when he wrapped his arms around Marcus, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just belonging. Noel felt his breath catch for a moment, something deep in his chest loosening all at once. Not sharp, not painful, just relief in its purest form. And when Marcus looked up again, his gaze found Noel's, steady, unspoken, but clearer than anything they could have said. Later, when the room had quieted and the day had softened into something smaller, more personal, Noel stood by the window for a moment, watching the light shift outside, and Marcus came to stand beside him without a word, close enough that the space between them didn't exist anymore. "You're thinking again," Marcus said, quietly, and Noel let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "A little," he admitted, then added, softer. "I keep wondering if this is real." Marcus didn't answer right away, just reached out, his hand finding Noel's, steady as always. "It is," he said simply, and Noel nodded, not because he needed reassurance anymore, but because he finally believed it. Behind them,